发的技术上应该有一些比较大的突破，它的能量密度会提升，比现有技术的提升是这个，就是产业化，我讲的是产业化，而不是研发，研发领域可能超过这个水平。你像我们承担的科技，刚才介绍了科技部向我们要求我们研发领域达到300每公斤350瓦时，更多了。但是1倍以上的这个技术进步应该是完全可能，再加上其他技术的进步，应该促成这个产业快速发展。谢谢。
So I'd also like to reiterate what Mr. Li is saying is that China is definitely a leader in these types of innovations, technology. So if you think about what China can do very well, it's when the country puts its mind to doing something, it will succeed, okay? Which bodes really well for the environment because they've now made it an issue of trying to clean up the air. But to give you an example, when I was living in China in 2008, they were still considering the maglev train. So they had a short maglev train. I'd recommend you all get a chance to ride it if you go to Shanghai. It's about 430 kilometers an hour. And the thought at that time was they were going to build maglev rail all over China. But it became kind of clear that you need too much right-of-way and the network is just too difficult to try to install the infrastructure. So they decided to move to high-speed rail. Okay? By 2012, they had a pretty complete network all over China. When you think about that compared to the US, where you get Obama paying some lip service to high-speed rail, and we're finally hiring the Chinese to make something from San Diego to LA, and you know, it's a totally different speed and a different kind of culture on getting things done. And so the same thing applies to the battery world. So China wants to be a leader in this market, and they will be a leader in this market. As I said earlier, if you go to Stanford and walk around, you can find BYD buses, fully electric buses. Those are Chinese buses, right? And you can see BYD and other companies, First Automobile Works in China and various things that are implementing these technologies today. And so, yeah, absolutely, China is going to be a leader. Whether or not you consider them the leader today is just a matter of time.
I got a question towards Mr. Hayes. I know Exponent is a very reputable company in safety FA analysis. I would like to know that in the past several years, the cases that you deal with multiple companies, not just in the US, but globally, do you see a trend on the safety pack, on the pack safety improvement, and any trend in design technology, any new tricks among those global companies that would help or enable a much safer design for EV usage?
Yeah, that's good. Appreciate the question. I mean, the answer is yes, they're making incremental changes. If you go to various different battery conferences, you'll hear some people talking about this magic special sauce they can add to the battery. But ultimately, as Dr. Meehan was talking about earlier, when you deal with organic electrolytes, okay, it's still going to be flammable. I showed in the presentation, you look at lithium iron phosphate versus the lithium cobalt aluminum, lithium nickel aluminum, sorry. If it heats up, it's still going to burn. So until we get to an electrolyte that's non-flammable, until either it's a solid electrolyte or whether we get to something where it's a non-organic electrolyte that's flammable, you're only going to have these incremental kind of protection electronics and various things. So certainly they're making improvements, they always are. A lot of work with impedance algorithms by TI and looking at how the health of the cell changes over time. You're able to monitor that with your electronics and try to make sure, not talking about balancing and these various things. So we're certainly making improvements. But as long as you have a flammable cell, ultimately it's not going to be the holy grail, right? And so then, I guess.
I just want to add, actually safety is not just the design of the system. It goes from the chemistry, the component of the electrodes, to the electrolyte, as you mentioned, and then the design, if you have a lousy design, even though you have a safe cathode, it can blow up, and then to the full, management system. So it's not just a management system. So you have to look at the rules. Yeah. Now, on the electrolyte, if you are able to contain it, there are ways of controlling the flammability using non-flammable, say additives, for example, that can retard the flame. The problem is once you bend, then you have the mercy of no one. It's going to take. So therefore, developing non-flammable electrolytes to basically completely shut down.
So the real true safe pack design would be going after the solid state, where we don't have electrolyte issue.
Well, as I mentioned, it can develop non-flammable electrolytes. That does not touch flame. As long as the product of reactivity within the cell does not form gases that are flammable, then you're okay. Problem with the solid state battery is the expansions that can create interfacial issues that are very difficult to work on. But it's not going to happen 2-3 years.
And one of the challenges, and I would also defer to Dr. Amin to see what kind of innovations are happening there, but one of the roadblocks is what can you actually make scalable, right? And so as we come up with new technology, if you look at the gigafactory that Elon Musk is putting together, if all of a sudden you come up with a technology that's not a transfer type process with a wet mix, it's going to be very hard to then rebuild all the infrastructure you have with these 1,000 factories in China and all these factories in Japan and various places. So you really need to come up with a technology that can still use the same manufacturing technologies and avoid these problems, right? If you come up with something totally new, the same problem we had in the 80s with the first electric car, right? You couldn't have charging stations, you couldn't make something with the infrastructure you need. So the next step has to be using our current infrastructure that we finally, after all these efforts, succeeded in building.
And that basically strengthened the use of non-flammable electrolyte, because the electrolyte can just fill it. Don't have to invest anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for either Kevin or Dr. Amin. So the Kevin, you mentioned about the BMW, the new upgrade version i3 used the nickel-rich NCM, right? Whether they use like the competition 622 or 811, is that cathode, the nickel-rich NCM, belong to argon patent or 3M patent? Maybe Dr. Amin, you may. I'm very actually, yeah.
Well, if you look at the patents, the date, just look at the date, and you can see that argon patent is 1 year older and much more broader formulation one. The clear patent is basically a very weird flag that says that it will not change its snap after a certain cycle. And maybe find that for 5 or 6 cycles. So the answer is that argon patent.
So that you think that's a it's argon patent?
LG and GM has actually licensed argon. It's well known. So.
Okay, thank you for the answer.
Or like a translate.
Hey, I have a question because I believe Dr. Hayes and Dr. Lee have also mentioned about intellectual property. My question is about in the current technology area, and I believe that U.S. has a more mature technology than China, and in terms of how to share the intellectual property wisely, and how does that play a role in either EV or battery right now, and how do you think it's helping or is like discouraging because of intellectual property?
You want to start?
我们应该都作为一个国先进式上市公司啊，作为这个中国的一些技术型企业必须跟知识产权，这是一个最基本的要求。第二个也在保护知识产权。我们公司每个月也有30项以上的法律，我们已经也有700多项的法律案子。我们希望大家在这个过程中间都得保护这个知识产权。第二个问题呢，就是知识产权之间是互相，我觉得应该互相交流，把它有常识，把它分享一些知识，这是应该是要做的。因为前面讲过的人类的文明和进步，都是站在前人努力的基础之上的，每一点点进步会出现一个新的创新，会产生更多的知识产权，这种产权都应该都得到一个充分的尊重，也有更重要的一个层面，得到更多的交流，否则这个产权也就没有知识产权也没有意义，这是第二个层面。第三个层面，我相信 就引领人类社会的进步，肯定是建立在知识和智慧的基础之上。但更重要的是，把这些知识产权和这些知识转化为我们产业化的生产的方法，真正为人类社会做服务。我相信它的价值是更高的。
So I think that the IP issue in China is going to solve itself. Right? There is still concerns with protection of IP, such that even foreign companies who open operations in China will not share all the IP they have internally with that subsidiary. But this is really going to solve itself, and it goes back to the question earlier about who's going to lead the world in technology. As China starts to develop its own IP, then the only way it's going to be able to protect that IP is to protect IP inside of China. Okay? And so it's going to be kind of a self-policing thing. Once China has enough IP that it needs to protect, then it understands the value of doing that, and this stuff is going to kind of solve itself. So, I mean, it's a hard thing to get around at this point, but things are a lot better now than they were in the 90s, for example. And so I think, to answer your question as best I can, I think that IP, the more IP innovation that happens in China, the quicker this will kind of solve itself.
我补充介绍一下，就是改革开放刚开始阶段，中国的国门刚刚打开，外面的东西都非常先进，所以在那个前几十年中间，中国有很多的东西是复制的经济，我称之为复制经济。现在中国的经济和中国的人才的培养都已经达到空前的高涨，复制时代已经过去了，已经走上了一个创新发展的时代。就是有些成果是共享的，还有更多的知识是需要我们共同去创造的。所以知识产权和在不同的阶段，它应该是一个不断稳定的升级的一个过程。在未来的发展，我以前给他们讲过一个观点，好像在新能源汽车这个领域上，中国可能够为人类社会的进步做出我们自己的新的技术贡献。为什么呢？因为第一个问题刚才讲过了，就中国有巨大的市场需求，这种市场需求吸引了一大批人才投身到这个产业里面去创造和创新，这是市场需求拉得最大。第二，中国环境迫切需要用新能源替代传统能源，因为能源有两，我们今天讨论主题有两块，第一块是创造，就是生产能源，比如太阳能、风能，还有火力发电的有效的利润生产能源。第二块是储存能源，我觉得储存能源在中国来讲更为重要，更为需要走得更快。那么这个技术呢，我当年做电池技术我研究过，就人类社会发展史以来，在储能领域是技术进步最慢的，也最落后的一个产业，现在是刚刚打开。我补充介绍一下。
Yeah, I do agree. Actually, I see now from the academy, the Chinese universities and national labs, they are producing a lot of quality IP. So the more they do that, they will have to start respecting IP rules, because otherwise they will be neglected. So you're right. So we can take care of it.
Question about?
Hi, Dan Miller from the Water Group. Here's a more general question for everyone. There was some discussion during the talks about renewable energy being expensive compared to fossil fuel energy, yet the true cost of fossil fuel does not include all the costs, the health impacts, the environmental impacts, and of course the climate impacts, and that makes it actually extremely expensive when all those costs are included. So the question to the group is, what should be done to correct that market failure? If that's it.
Well, the easy answer would be carbon pricing. Whether it is feasible in the US or not, it's a different story. In Europe, you have a sort of carbon pricing because you pay a liter of gasoline the same as much as you pay a gallon of gasoline in the US. So in Europe, it will be more complicated because if you start to think about carbon tax, you probably have people rioting in the streets because they're already paying an awful lot of money for that. And this goes to the fact that if you don't have a level playing field, it's going to be difficult to price technology correctly, and then you create market asymmetries that someone has to pay for. And my comment, since we were talking about this before, is I think, as I said, I did say that there's been a huge improvement in renewable cost. But I always see this in the optic of the scale that we need. And right now, integration of renewable into the grid is using the infrastructure that already existed. The problem will come when you need to build an infrastructure or change it drastically. Who's going to pay for that? Are governments going to pay for it? Are private companies going to pay for it? In Europe, you have the example, and I was thinking when you were talking about the trains, how did the US build the railways in the States? They didn't pay the companies, they just gave them land on each side of the railways, and the result was that the rails are now the shortest way from point A to point B, because if you take a longer route, you get more land. In Europe, it was totally different when it came to infrastructure, because a lot of the energy infrastructure was built by the national oil companies. And being national oil companies, they were part of the government, but then the business model was a model where you were selling the commodity, so capillarity was important. The moment the EU changed the system and forced the company to spin off the pipelines, for example, and told the companies that not only you have to spin them off, you have to sell them, and you have to reduce the amount of gas, for example, that you transfer further. You're actually changing the business model, because the new company has a business model that is based on selling a transportation fee. Expanding the infrastructure and even maintaining the infrastructure, for them is a cost. So if regulators do not take into consideration this situation, it's going to be difficult to have an infrastructure that will allow the penetration of renewables that we need at scale.
So yeah, I agree with the carbon taxes. The other kind of straightforward way, and it ties into exactly what you said, was basically you have to have a higher price of gas in the U.S. I grew up in Southeast Alaska, and at that time, one of the byproducts of the timber industry was you could actually use the waste product from the timber industry to make ethanol, not corn ethanol, but cedar and tree-based ethanol. And that could actually be made economically if the price of gas was $2 a gallon. Unfortunately, the entire industry collapsed before the price of gas actually got that high. But the point is, you need to have the price of gas high enough to develop these innovations, to drive these innovations. And in the US, we're kind of resistant to having high gas prices, obviously.
I'm opposite. That.
I have one question for the entire panel and a question specific for Dr. Amin. For the entire panel, what's your assessment of the outlook for the hybrids versus just pure electric vehicles? The question for Dr. Amin is, I would like you to give an assessment of where the technological innovations are taking place in China in particular, because you work for an national lab, I think, in the US, and one of the pillars of state support for technological innovation, right? And as you travel to China so often and see where these technical breakthroughs are taking place, are they taking place in the state labs or in the Academy of Sciences or the universities or in the private sector?
Okay, I can start with the second question, I guess. From my experience and interaction with the scientists in China, I think the innovation is happening both at the national lab and the universities. Mostly for the next generation batteries. Companies usually they scan around what is going on and try to produce or maybe most of the work the companies do is a system learning, where it is out of the university and national average. But on the chemistry, for instance, I think I've seen mostly universities, famous universities like Tsinghua University of China or Peking or John. I've seen quite a bit of innovation coming out. And also the Chinese Academy of Science. So the other question is what? On the hybrid, I guess? Well, you know, when a technology, that's my opinion, the hybrid is very, I would say, practical, it's cheaper, and it will take a while to displace. And the reason is that you don't need energy, you just need power. There are chemistries that exist now that have tremendous power that led to reduced costs, and they can cycle for 15 years because they are very shallow cycles, just to charge sustaining. I can see that when the lithium ion and the high energy start coming in, like in the plug-in requirement is much more severe because we have two conditions we have to meet. The charge depleting to get the electric drive range and the charge sustaining to basically charge the battery. So those has to be met. If one of them is dropped, you're out. So it's very, very challenging and it's going to take a while to expand. But from my experience, I think once the technology is well established, it will stay for a while before it displaces.
I mean, the good thing about the hybrid is people don't need to participate, right? There's no infrastructure you need to worry about. You pay for it up front, and you get the benefit, but you're still putting gas in the pump with the existing infrastructure. And not until we have a really extensive infrastructure for charging stations everywhere are you going to be able to get rid of that, right? So you can consider it a transitional technology, but it's a long transition.
Yeah, I agree with that. The hybrid is a low-cost way to get a large difference in fuel economy. You're only adding, 1 kilowatt-hour battery pack or half kilowatt-hour battery pack. Your electric machine, your inverter, you can do in 30 to 50 kilowatt range. So it's a very low cost. You don't need a charger and so on. I see that the PHEV is probably the challenging technology between the HEV, PHEV, and EV, because as these 200-mile EV vehicles become more prevalent, more cost effective, the purpose of the PHEV initially was to alleviate range